Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and we're so grateful that you are joining us today as we kind of move into the month of August. And for some of you, that means school is starting up next week. For others of you, you've still got a good month left here of vacation. But we hope you've had a good summer, and we hope this Q Ideas community has been life-giving to you, just a way of encouraging you every week to think well about a multitude of issues. And today is going to be no different as we get to engage in a conversation specifically around digital. And what does it mean for the church to think about digital? What does it mean in this last year as more and more churches started to go online? What were some of the upsides of that? But were there also some fallouts? Are there some pitfalls in thinking too much about the role technology ought to have within our church? Before we get into that conversation, though, I want to remind you that we have launched something we've never done before, unprecedented for us here at Q Ideas to do, and that is to create a learning community over the next year that's going to go much deeper into every one of these types of topics, all these conversations that you want to have, but there's not always a space to have it. We're going to line those up over the next 9 months so that you have the opportunity alongside 100 other leaders around the country and around the world to have conversations of consequence around cultural issues, around how we view the world, around what it means to be Christian and navigate faithfully a chaotic society, and all the many ideas coming at us, right? From individualism to a lot of the current issues that we all are having conversations about, whether that be justice or race or LGBTQ or anything. I mean, you name it. We're planning to get into it over the next 9 months and have reading lists and books every month that you're reading alongside a community, as well as being able to access some of the best thinkers and voices around these topics where you can actually ask your questions and get those answered. And this is all going to happen through our collaborative that we're creating. That's launching in September. It's going to be an incredible 8-month journey. And you can learn more about that. You can read all about it and give us your information to be a part of that at qideas.org/cohort. I think you're going to enjoy this because it's not just going to be a large group experience. We're breaking these down into groups of 25 based on your different vocation and the place you are in life and your context to make sure you're learning from other leaders like you who are facing similar questions and to wrestle with this content, these ideas, these conversations amidst a community of people this year that are committed to growing and committed to continuing to challenge themselves and challenge the opportunities that we have within this current season. So check that out at qideas.org/cohort. Now today, you'll kind of experience the kinds of conversations we want to be having within this cohort, and that is, what does it mean for us to think well about digital technology and the way that it interfaces with the church? We've seen over the last decade, more and more churches have online services, some even hiring online campuses, some churches that exist entirely in the online space. And what's the upside of that? What's the downside of that? Today, we're going to talk with Keith Robinson, who's somebody who's focused on this, studied about this. He's written a lot about this to try to help churches think well and really with this balanced view about technology. He serves as the Senior Associate for Communications at Slingshot Group, and this is an organization that works with and consults hundreds of organizations, nonprofits, and churches all over the U.S. to help them think well about the way that they're interacting and innovating within this current culture. And so I was excited today to get to talk with Keith, ask him some of my questions about this, wrestle with my pushback on technology being the be-all, end-all of what it means to be the church, and to let you kind of listen in and engage in that conversation. So let's welcome in now Keith Robinson. Keith, it's great to have you with us today on the Q Ideas podcast. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Gabe. Great to be here today.
Yeah, well, I was just mentioning, we were so encouraged to have you with us at our Culture Summit this year and really talking about a topic that every pastor, church leader I know over the last years had to grapple with, and it's the idea of what does it mean to be digital? What does it mean to think about the church in a digital age during this COVID season where so many churches, whether they were reluctant or not, they were forced to think about, how do I reach people when they're not showing up physically in my church? And this is something you've been thinking about for much longer, pre-COVID days. You've been thinking about and working with so many churches around. And so let's just step back from the COVID moment and say, hey, even before COVID, kind of where were we at as the church as it related to digital? And then I want to move to how did COVID just completely ramp that up?
Yeah, that's a great premise for this conversation. And thanks again so much for the invitation to be at the Culture Summit. Just love learning with this community. And just to be a contributor was, a real honor and a privilege. And really, from our perspective at Slingshot Group, it was the result of collective learnings and compounded learnings that we shared based on our work in the church. And as you said, at Slingshot Group, we were working on this and in this space for many years. And through my work with Slingshot over the last 5 years, my focus has almost exclusively been on helping churches and faith-based nonprofits build out their digital communications teams and strategies. So that starts with identifying and recruiting leaders in the space who are skilled to help churches to know what the opportunities are and to leverage technology in a way that draws them closer to the people that God's called them to serve. So we began working directly with those on the front lines of this new frontier of digital and exploring ways to connect people in the community. And then, of course, as you stated, just over a year ago, the pandemic caused churches to shutter their services, and overnight, pastors were forced to speak to empty rooms full of people, or the empty rooms that were once full of people. And overnight, every church in America became a broadcast studio. And our team's goal in that season was to just ask questions. How do we help you to maximize this moment to expand the reach of your ministry? And so that's really what we've been doing. And over the last, 15, 16 months, year and a half, almost now, since the pandemic, we have just seen an explosion of opportunities and ministry for digital. And it's been amazing, fascinating to watch, and really cool to be a part of.
Well, let's first talk about some of the opportunities that have come as a result of going digital at a time where a lot of churches hadn't done this before, or maybe they were doing it before, and they started to step into this moment where, like you said, nobody's in the seat. The seat is now a living room couch, and, pastors are inviting people to stand up and sing, and they're inviting people to engage or to text in, their thoughts or encouragement or where they're at, or Instagram. It's like, for a lot of people, this is a whole new frontier, like you said. And you were helping them navigate that. But what were the opportunities that came? And then we're going to circle back around and talk about what are some of the weaknesses of all of this? Is this really the future? Is it the best way for the church to go? Is it just one piece of the puzzle? But I want to first just kind of capture, what are you seeing as the opportunity to go digital for churches?
I think more than anything, and I talked about this in the session that I had, that we live in a culture that feels with its eyes. And one of the things that we've been helping churches and organizations with over the last several years is helping those organizations find visual storytellers who can leverage video and visual storytelling in a way to connect with people in a real meaningful way. And we've all seen this, right? We've all watched videos that grabbed our attention, that caught us in a moment where we might have otherwise been distracted, but all of a sudden we're drawn in. And so, like never before, it feels like the church has an opportunity to discern this moment and to lean into this visual storytelling world, to really capture and tell the greatest story that's ever been told in a compelling way. We live in a culture that's really distracted. So to be able to leverage the power of story with visual tools, I think gives the church sort of an unfair advantage right now. Think about, where are some of the most powerful stories that a person could hear that's happening every day, every week in a community? I think we have to look no further than the local church. And so what we've been trying to help churches realize and discern is that opportunity and how to curate stories from within the body to share those in the digital space so that people see it's more than just our songs and our sermons that we're turning out online and asking people to participate in. It's really an invitation to life change and an invitation to transformation.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about this around the Q Ideas community for a while, this debate about the church, digital, how much do we adopt this new medium as a way to expand, to reach more people, to have increased numbers of people come into contact with the message of Jesus. in the gospel versus how critical is it that we be in person and that we're embodied and that, could this be a distraction? Could, like you said, in the digital revolution, everybody's on their phones. Everybody's experiencing life through this little device. And so is it better to be countercultural? Is it better to say, you know what, we don't show up there. You actually have to be embodied and show up in person. And I raised that to say, I know one of the things you've advocated for churches is that they pursue thinking about online campus pastors and actually creating entire focuses and church leadership that's fully digital. And I'm curious, in your vision for that, do those people ever show up anywhere, or is the interaction always through commenting, always through email, always through some sort of digital texting interaction? And in your view, is that enough these days to disciple people and to reach people?
Gabe, that's a great question, and I know that tension well. And we wrestle with that tension even in my home church. Like, what does it mean when we talk about using digital and online strategies to connect people? And I'm reminded, I've become friends over the last couple of years with a rabbi here in our community, and I was talking to him, and one of my first conversations with him, he said, you can be a Jew on an island all by yourself, but you can't practice Judaism. And when we think about what it means to belong to this family of God, there's a lot of Christians right now, because of the pandemic, that found themselves in isolation. But to practice our faith, we need community. So while digital is a medium that we can use that can accelerate our efforts to reach people and mobilize people, I believe that it's just a tool. Now, this is my personal conviction, that it is a tool and a means to an end. And so I don't think that we can do Christianity and practice our faith just in that online space. Like, we need life on life discipleship. We need life on life connection happening, because that's where transformation takes place. And we don't get to practice the one another's in every way without being present at some point with one another. So again, as a means, as a tool, as a bridge, I think digital is a great medium for us. But if we veer into the territory of telling people, hey, you never have to show up, you never have to do life with one another or serve one another, then I think we're missing a big part of the gospel.
Yeah, so you see it as a complementary resource tool. We have to have it. It's not everything. And I do think we've seen after the pandemic the lack of people coming back to churches. I don't know the latest data this month on that, but I know most churches have seen a significant decrease in how many people are now physically responding now that we are, quote unquote, more open, as a society. And so I'm curious, and I've talked to other people too, friends who've said, yeah, we've just been watching online. We kind of got used to this. It's become part of our lifestyle to, it's easier. It's way more convenient to just kind of sit in our living room and watch it when we're home. And that almost had become a bit normative. And so it's hard for people to break out of that habit and now kind of get back into showing up. And yet when people have shown up, those who've lived in states, unlike Tennessee, but certain states where they were not allowed to gather, or they're still kind of just coming back in, and you talk to someone who experiences corporate worship, where they're standing together, they're lifting their hands, they're singing together, and they're kind of overwhelmed going, oh my gosh, I didn't know how much I missed this. Like, I'd kind of grown used to the digital experience, and there's something about us all being together and singing in one voice that feels transcendent and feels different. And so one of my concerns would just be, man, over this last year, do you think we've lost some segment of the population that now showing up in person is not going to be part of their future routine?
Yeah, and I think that's the right concern that faith leaders should be wrestling with and grappling with. And I would answer that question by asking a question. And that is, of faith leaders, it would be a great time for all of us to ask, what have our gatherings produced? Have our gatherings produced more disciples, more devoted followers of Jesus? And so I think it's time for us as faith leaders to take a fresh look at what we do with our gatherings and what the real outcome of that is. And the other thing I'd say is that cultural Christianity is dead. or nearly dead. It might be on life support.
Right.
And I think the pandemic just sort of revealed what was already there in terms of commitment. Like we were watching this slow decline. I talk with a lot of pastors every week, and attendance patterns have been shifting for years. Regular, sort of faithful people in our churches, went from being a weekly attender, twice a month, to all of a sudden they're once every 6 weeks, once every 8 weeks. And sometimes those are the elders and the deacons. And so I think what we found is that there has just been this huge shift. And in that, there's been, I think, two things that have happened. For the nominal Christian or believer, they may have used it as an opportunity or an excuse just to go ahead and check out. But for the mature follower and for the person who, is deeply devoted and to walking out and living out their faith and culture, you're right, Gabe. There is a huge longing to regather, to be together, to break bread, to worship together, to see our kids hang out. Like, we sense that. And so I think that we're just seeing a shifting that's revealing what was in the heart of people. And as a Jesus follower, I'm a part of a family of God that runs generations deep. So there's going to be a natural draw for me to want to connect and share life with other believers. And just anecdotally, I was worshiping in Las Vegas this last weekend. And it was that moment in the service where you turn around and you greet your neighbor. It's like an introvert's nightmare. And so I'm introverted. So I turned around and I shook hands with a woman. And I just asked her, how long have you been coming to blank church? And she said, well, actually, I started attending during the pandemic online. I had moved and relocated to the area, was looking for a church. And then once services opened up, I started coming, and I've been here ever since. Now, they opened up last year, so she's been in the church for going on a year now. And it was all because, this church had a really strong online presence and strategy. They're one of our partners, and they were able to connect with this person who was actually looking not for an excuse to not belong, but rather a family to belong to. So, really powerful story.
Yeah, and those stories are powerful. There's no doubt that using digital communication and so many of the new ways that people are hearing and gathering information and curating, the information and messages that they want to hear, that the church showing up in that space and Christian leaders and truth and messages and evangelism is so important. I know even within our organization, we try to support and help a lot of young leaders, and there's some that are now TikTok evangelists and preachers, and they're getting their message out by all means necessary. But when it comes to ecclesiology and trying to understand, well, what's the nature of the church and how should the church function and operate so that people are coming into a community of embodied believers who are going to live alongside one another and hold one another accountable and live life together. We're so far from that in most of our American experiences, at least, that this just feels like one more add-on that we're kind of used to. But I think what you said is so important, that this year has helped. It really became a great reckoning. And you see the great resignation idea of all these people walking away from their corporate jobs and saying, hey, I'm going to go pursue some other career. I think that's what happened in the church. You had that resignation of the nominal Christians.
Right.
And you can see even in the data how much giving stayed strong. Yeah. I mean, all these pastors just shocked, and boards and elders sitting around going, oh my goodness, if we don't have church, we're not going to continue to see sustained tithing or giving, and that's going to radically transform our ministry. And lo and behold, after a year, most of these churches still thriving financially without people showing up. It kind of shows you how much that core group of people, that probably 20% of the church that really is deeply engaged and biblically minded, and they're going to give whether they're showing up at a service or not. We're still engaged, and we had that backing off of those who were not. As you think about the season ahead, so let's look at the next decade, and I know you can never predict the future here, but as you think about the next generation, how much they have grown up looking at screens, thinking about digital, getting their information from those places, that medium even shaping their minds, even shaping their distractions and their attention span, and so many of these new factors that we've seen coming for a while, but man, it's really come home to roost. Do you think digital is the primary way that a new generation will be reached with the message of the gospel?
I think, again, it's got to be a part of the conversation, because we're talking about a generation. Just before we started the podcast, Gabe, you and I were commiserating for a minute that, I've got 2 teenagers, and I readily recognize the inherent dangers in technology. And I think the opportunity, though, for the church in the future, just think about this. 20 years ago, we couldn't talk to strangers. But today, we sleep in their beds, we drive their cars, we accept their reviews of everyday products that we use. The world has changed. And so I think the opportunity for us to converse with culture, if we're not present on digital mediums and platforms and having conversations in that space, then I think it's not just lacking relevance. We're just not in the place. If we're not there, we're not in the place where people are. I mean, I read a stat the other day that said that if Facebook were a country, it would be the 4th largest nation in the world. And so for churches, that opportunity, and I think going forward into the future, I think we will see less songs and sermons, and I think we will see more care being demonstrated by our churches. And I just want to give context to that, because we certainly need worship and we need preaching. But until last year, most of churches' online efforts were posting songs and sermons. But as a person who didn't grow up in the church, I'm probably not going to stop on one of those songs or listen to one of those sermons. I might, but instead of just using it as a bulletin board for events and activities or a place to post songs and sermons, what if we use social media to actually be social? We've seen this. I mean, social media is a powerful tool for activating people, and I think that's the untapped potential for the church when it comes to digital. Is activating and mobilizing people more than just trying to regather them. Instead, how do we mobilize them to go out and to be the hands and the feet of Jesus? And if we could turn the spotlight up on that in our social feeds and our online platforms, then I believe we'll get the world's attention. And to me, the greatest opportunities for the church as it relates to digital is for evangelism.
Yeah.
To introduce new people to what we're about. And so often, if a non-believer were just to do a quick survey of 10 churches in America and watch their social feeds, what would they get? Would they see mostly sermons and hear mostly sermons and see mostly songs? Or would they see people who are living out their faith and culture, who are loving their neighbors well, who are responding to the needs? I mean, when Jesus announced his ministry, he said, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release from captivity those who are in prison." Like, Jesus was bringing actual good news to his community, and it was disruptive. And I wonder if we would turn the spotlight up on our care. I believe more now than ever that our greatest play in culture as the church is empathy, because compassion has always been the church's superpower.
Yeah, that's such a good word and so important. And I do think the good news is so many churches have fully understood that. I would say in the last couple of decades, there's been a huge shift in that. I know since we began Q in 2007, that was a new thought for a lot of churches, that it wasn't just about this attractional idea, that there was a mission that needed to be taken care of, and that we needed to care about everything going on in our communities that's unjust, that needs repair, that needs restoration. And so the theology, I feel like, has come back around. People are understanding this to be true. And your point about utilizing social media to tell that story and to help capture people and engage people with a new understanding of what the church is, I do think is critical. I know some of the research Barna did recently with one of our partners described this whole idea of, the community believes churches should be helping with kids after school, that problem of children not really having a place to go for these 3 hours after work, still a problem. And churches and communities should do that. They also said mental health, like counseling, sitting with the elderly who are lonely. And you think about the loneliness epidemic in our society, the world's looking and going, hey, the church could show up in that. The church could be incredible parts of that. And of course, using technology to mobilize, to get those stories in front of people, to give people the ways to opt in And, I know our church has a morning 7 a.m. devotional that goes out every morning. Text comes to me. It makes it very simple for me to just touch one button and then I get to hear this devotional. Those kinds of things just didn't exist before. And I think as we look to the future, that kind of innovation is important. But I think where we've come, you and I in this conversation, I mean, it's that this complementary vision of how technology is used maybe on the outskirts to reach, to invite, to engage, to capture somebody's attention that maybe would never even be thinking about church or how the role of the body of Christians plays into their life. And once you get their attention, man, you're trying to slowly work people into real community, into embodied life with believers. Because once we're in that, I mean, that experience is so radically unique. And I know Jesus was embodied. I remember Kevin Kelly would talk about this. I interviewed him once for a book I did called The Next Christians, and he spoke at Q a couple times. He was ruthless. He was a co-founder of Wired Magazine, but ruthless about how much he wasn't going to let technology overtake embodied relationships. And he himself, preferred to talk to you over the phone instead of an email because he knew that was a little better than email, but not quite as good as face-to-face. There was just this commitment, and he based that on Jesus being embodied. And the power of that, that Jesus' incarnation represents to us, that there's kind of nothing that beats showing up in a person's life. And I think that's just going to maintain and be universally true. Well, tell us in closing, your work is to help so many pastors navigate these kinds of situations. And I know you mentioned a church you're working with in Las Vegas, but you guys work with a lot of different organizations, nonprofits, not just churches, but people trying to navigate this. When you're in these conversations, just to give our community a bit of an idea with leaders like that, what are you finding is kind of their number one need right now, their question coming out of this COVID season, and they're trying to recalibrate, what are we going to do in 2021, 22? How has this radically shifted where our focus ought to go? What is the theme that you're seeing emerge from multiple leaders about where their focus and attention is going to be?
Yeah, Gabe, I think that like never before, churches are looking to gather, but also to mobilize their people and figuring out what that gathering means. Like, who are the people in my congregation? Every week that I'm talking to pastors, they're telling me as we're regathering, like, we have new people we've never met before. We don't know half of our congregation. We're seeing this a lot. Just there's been this resettling of people in new communities vocationally. So there's just been a lot of movement. I think we're going to look back at this time and see that there was this scattering of believers. So what I hear faith leaders really leaning into is, how do we design our organization in such a way that can connect with the people who want to belong, who want to be devoted followers of Jesus? And then how do we get them into community and mobilize them for the gospel? And so I think there's a lot of organization design thinking going on right now, and that's where Slingshot's work often is, as it relates to how do you build and mobilize a great team, people who are vocationally committed to this work, and so that's really where where we intersect with the church, is helping them think through what are the opportunities in their community and how do they design their organization in such a way to bring a great team together. And so we're all about building remarkable teams. And you said something a moment ago that we're watching. There are people who are leaving corporate America left and right and looking for opportunities to put their skills to work in the kingdom. And over half of the leaders that we are placing or mobilizing in this space, in the digital space, going on staff at churches, are actually marketplace leaders who had no ministry experience, at least vocationally, before this, but the opportunities like never before have opened up for them. And so we're seeing a lot of them answer that call. And so we're also helping churches navigate what it means to employ people with a different set of skills than they've ever employed before, and use how to coach them and onboard them well and release them into this new season that's fascinating and full of opportunity.
Yeah, so I'll ask you this, Keith. If there's somebody listening right now and they're hearing that and they're in sort of corporate America and they're going, look, I'm called to do something a little different right now, or I want to invest my skills here.
Mm-hmm.
Where would they go to let you know that, since you're the one that's pretty aware of all the opportunities that might exist in the space?
Yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with that individual. We've got a team of people. I started this, it was just me, as we launched out in this digital communications area, helping churches navigate this. And we've grown, obviously, since then. Even prior to the pandemic, we were seeing growth. And so we've got a great team of people that can walk with leaders in that season of discerning. We have a process that, once we determine, since, this person's sensing a call and there might be opportunity for them to pursue a role at a church or a nonprofit, then we begin a process with them that'll, take a couple of weeks with interviews with our team. And, we have some great tools that can help them as they're starting to process what that might look like. And then, the end result of that would be connecting them to one of our church partners, potentially for, an interview or a job.
So where would they go? To slingshotgroup.org.
Yep.
They could get in touch with you guys there. So if that's you and you're kind of hearing this conversation and that is scratching an itch that you've had or something you've been praying about, feel free to reach out to Keith's team and get into that conversation. I would just say, Keith, thanks for your good work here. It's a season where it's like this great reset happening in the church. It recalibrates and usually always ends up better than it was. So it can be painful. It can be that curve that goes down and you don't see the fruit of it just yet, but I'm confident God continues to build his church and we're going to see it continue to get healthier and stronger. And so these kinds of conversations only help all of us think well about the nature of digital within that environment, as well as the depth of how God created the church that may never change and the beauty of that. So thank you for entering into that conversation with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Gabe.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Keith and just getting to explore all the different elements of this. There's no simple answers to this. We have to come into all these conversations understanding there's complexity. And the more we just make things simple and say it's this or that, it's black or white, there's no gray, there's no room for disagreement here, I think we do ourselves a disservice. We want to have a balanced approach. We want to try to understand, how can we think well about this? The digital medium is a medium. Those mediums do have biases. Sometimes the bias can be a negative bias. Sometimes it can be neutral, and sometimes it can be positive. So we have to ask those deeper questions that I think are critical for Christians as we navigate the digital age and understand how this technology is going to be used for good and also can be used for bad. And so I'm appreciative of Keith being willing to take on some of those conversations. And again, if you're interested in learning more about their work, maybe even reading some of the work that they've done on how online campuses work for churches, if you happen to be a pastor, an elder, a leader at your church, you may want to learn more. You can go to slingshotgroup.org, and their resource page has information on that. Or if you're somebody listening, or you know somebody who said, hey, I'd love to pursue a different type of vocation and a job that might be different than where I'm at, feel free to go to them too. They have access to so many different opportunities and ways in which you could engage, and maybe you'll find your unique calling for this next season of your life. Again, if you want to be a part of the cohorts I mentioned at the top of this, you can learn more at qideas.org/cohort. This kicks off in September, and we would love to have you be a part of it. So check that out at qideas.org/cohort, and we'll look forward to seeing you there and joining you again next week.